Good morning, everyone. How are you today? Okay. Welcome back. Just letting a few of your classmates in here, and we'll get started. Okay. So congratulations getting through the second lecture exam of the semester. As I said, the average is still quite modest, but for some of you as individuals, you had a very good score. So congratulations on that. Hopefully next week, everybody in the class will have completed the exam, and I'll be able to come back around and at least go over those two essays, which seem to be trouble points, the vitamin D and calcium homeostasis essay, as well as the neuromuscular junction essays were challenges for you. So we'll try to go back over them next week. Okay. So do you have any questions before we get started? Okay, well, let's continue then, folks. We are now officially starting the bottom 1/3 of content for the lecture portion of the semester. That would be chapters 12, 15, and 16 in lecture, which is all about the nervous system, right? So we're going to be focusing on the nervous system for the remaining weeks we have in this term. Okay, so let's get started here. I'm going to share my screen. All right, chapter 12. Chapter 12, the topic is nervous tissue. And it's in this chapter that we're going to go over some of the more cellular anatomy of neurons and talk to you about the physiology of electrical signals and things like this. So let's get started here. I am going to begin my conversation in chapter 12, going through the organization of the nervous system as it is outlined for you in your textbook in figure 12.1. Okay. Organizational overview of the nervous system, figure 12.1. So I encourage you to have your book open and be looking at that as we take some notes this morning. Okay, so when we talk about the nervous system, right? When we talk about the nervous system, we can start with the two major branches, right? The nervous system is made of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And you are starting to have some familiarity with that from our time in lab, right? We started that last week in lab. We're going to continue that conversation later this morning. So the central nervous system, you are aware, consists of your brain and spinal cord. And that's it. I mean, that's a lot. There's a lot of anatomy within the brain, as you are aware, but brain and spinal cord makes up the central nervous system. The peripheral nervous system refers to all the nervous system tissue that extends off the brain and spinal cord. Okay. All right. So as we continue our conversation, I'm going to try to organize things in nice, petite little pockets of information for you. The peripheral nervous system, as you can see from figure 12.1, is itself broken down into the sensory division and the motor division. So let's talk about those. Okay, so within the peripheral nervous system, we have the sensory division of the peripheral nervous system. You may recall a conversation we had in the early weeks of the semester when we were talking about homeostasis. And remember, I gave you this little story where we walked through some anatomy, and the story was about you looking outside your window and seeing the mail delivered. So you walked outside on a cold winter's day without your jacket on, remember? And sensory nerve endings embedded in your skin detected changes in air temperature, and then they sent electrical signals up spinal cord into the brain so that your brain was aware that your body is getting colder, right? And then the brain might have communicated to your muscles to twitch and contract to generate heat. This is the conversation we're having again right now. So the sensory division of the peripheral nervous system, you have sensory neurons, in this case embedded in the skin. When they detect changes in temperature or pressure, okay, they're going to generate electrical signals and send information into the spinal cord up to the brain. So that flow of information is going into the central nervous system. So the fancy word here is afferent. The sensory division is also the afferent division. Okay, so the sensory or afferent division of the peripheral nervous system uses sensory receptors to deliver information into the central nervous system. Okay, so I think that makes sense. Please ask questions if you have them. Within the sensory division, there's basically two pockets of senses, two pockets of machinery that we categorize. The sensory division would encompass those things known as the somatic senses. So this includes somatic senses. And when we say somatic senses, we're referring to the sensory neurons that allow your body to detect pressure at the surface of your body when somebody gives you a hug, or to detect changes in temperature with the outside surrounding air, or just to detect touch, right? If somebody's touching your arm to give you encouragement about something. Those sorts of sensory neurons are part of the somatic senses. Okay. Somatic senses typically include neurons that are kind of spread throughout your body, and they're not localized to necessarily any one specific region or structure. For example, you have temperature sensors in the skin of your arm, and you also have temperature sensors in the skin of your back, temperature sensors in the skin of your leg, right? It's all over the body. So the somatic senses typically involve receptors, sensory neurons that are involved throughout the entire anatomy of your body. In contrast to that, we also have the special senses. Special senses include sensory neurons that are defined with very discrete, specific structures like the eyes, the ears, the nose, that kind of thing. So we have special senses. Okay. This would include nervous system anatomy associated with larger structures that give us specific capabilities, such as eyesight for vision, hearing, detecting odors with our nose, okay? Okay. All right. So at any rate, we have the sensory division of the peripheral nervous system, and that always communicates into the central nervous system. Okay. A good example here of a special sense, which we've talked about before, is your taste buds, right? Your taste buds are structures that are on your tongue, and you're learning about them in lab at this time, right? If you're looking at the visible body material of the tongue. Okay, the taste buds are sensory organs, if you will, on the structure of the tongue, made of clusters of cells that include a sensory neuron that respond to molecules you're putting into your mouth from the food and drink that you're consuming, okay? All right. Okay, so that's the sensory division of the peripheral nervous system. Folks, do you have any questions right now? Okay, the second subdivision of the peripheral nervous system is going to be the motor division. The motor division is also known as the efferent division. Okay, so remember in our conversation, going outside in the cold air, right? Your sensory machinery sends information into the central nervous system. The brain makes a decision that you have left the proper healthy range of temperature for the body, so we don't have homeostasis anymore. So the brain is the command center. It creates instructions that tells the skeletal muscles to shiver. So the transmission of information out of the brain is going to be an efferent type of communication. So the motor division uses neurons to transmit information from the central nervous system to an effector. Okay. That effector is almost always going to be some type of muscle, typically skeletal muscle, but it could be the heart, so it could be cardiac muscle. It also could be smooth muscle around the wall of an artery. Okay, so your motor division might be trying to adjust blood pressure at some moment of time. So the effector is going to be some type of muscle and or some type of gland, because the motor division is also responsible for triggering the release of hormones from endocrine tissue in the body. Okay. All right, so typically muscles or glands are going to be effectors carrying out the instructions from the motor division of the peripheral nervous system. Okay. Now, the motor division of the peripheral nervous system can be subdivided into categories as well. Okay, the motor division can be subdivided into the somatic and autonomic nervous systems. All right, so we have the, first we have the somatic nervous system. The somatic nervous system is that part of the motor division which specifically sends information to your skeletal muscles, right? So you spend a lot of time learning the skeletal muscles for lab exam 2. We didn't really talk about how those muscles were controlled at that moment of time. But when we talk about, when we talk about a neuron at a neuromuscular junction releasing acetylcholine to trigger contraction of a skeletal muscle tissue, like the biceps brachii, then that's going to be part of the somatic nervous system's role to control those contractions of skeletal muscles. All right, so somatic nervous system conveys information from the central nervous system, the CNS, to skeletal muscles. Okay, so again, example here would be the neuromuscular junction that activates contraction of the biceps brachii muscle. Okay. We also have, within the motor division, we have the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system transmits information from the central nervous system to every other kind of effector we might imagine, such as smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, okay? Okay, so if we're moving skeletal muscle, it's the somatic nervous system regulating that. If we are adjusting our heart rate, that's going to be the autonomic nervous system. If we are adjusting the tension in smooth muscle in an artery, that's going to be the autonomic nervous system. If we are triggering the release of insulin from the pancreas, that is going to be the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so let's back up and be sure we appreciate what we're talking about here. The peripheral nervous system, which is all the tissue, nervous tissue outside the brain and spinal cord, can be divided into the sensory division, which sends information into the brain and spinal cord. Okay, it can be divided into the motor division, which neurons carry information out of their brain and spinal cord. The motor division can be further subdivided into the somatic nervous system, which regulates skeletal muscle contraction. The motor division can also be divided into the autonomic nervous system, which coordinates contraction of smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and the ejection of hormones from glandular tissue. Okay, so during your private study time, you're going to want to review this and perhaps make yourself some flow charts where you see the connectedness of one thing going to another thing, going to another thing, and make sure that you're okay with the hierarchical organization of the nervous system. Okay, the autonomic nervous system is further subdivided. Okay, we're almost done with this crazy pyramid we have here. All right, the autonomic nervous system can be broken down into three subcategories. The first subcategory we'll talk about is the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is made of neurons that, generally speaking, stimulate their effector, such as stimulating the heart to increase its rate of contraction. And you know, why would the body do that? Well, maybe maybe this is Halloween and somebody's scaring you, right? So you're scared and you need to increase your heart rate so you can power your circulatory system so you can run away. Okay, so neurons generally stimulate their effector. An example here would be increasing heart rate to respond to a threat. So this sympathetic nervous system is what we typically talk about when we're talking about fight or flight responses. The sympathetic nervous system is going to activate fight or flight responses. Okay, so let's see here. Let's try to make the notes readable here. Okay. All right, so the sympathetic nervous system is a subcategory of the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is a subcategory of the motor division of the peripheral nervous system. Okay. All right. The second subcategory of the autonomic nervous system is the parasympathetic nervous system. The parasympathetic nervous system includes neurons that generally, when they communicate with their target effector, they tend to cause the target effector to calm down and relax its activity. Okay, so neurons generally calm their effector. Okay, so the example would be neurons of the parasympathetic nervous system actually communicating with your heart to slow the heart rate down when you lay down at night to fall asleep, right? You're tired, you're exhausted, it's been a long day, you go to bed, you lay down, the neurons of the parasympathetic nervous system are going to cause your heart rate to lower, to drop as you relax, so that you can slip away into sleep and rejuvenate yourself, okay? So the parasympathetic nervous system typically is associated with calming processes. And so the catchphrase for that would be rest and digest. Rest and digest, right? We're coming up traditionally with a large meal next week for Thanksgiving. Folks sometimes overeat as part of the holiday. And so, right, you eat a little more than you should, and you kind of stumble to the sofa in the living room, and the television's on, and what do? You start to get a little sleepy and your eyes close, you feel like taking a nap. Part of that response is going to be the parasympathetic nervous system calming your body down so that the digestive system can handle all that load of tasty food that you've just consumed. So responsible for rest and digest activities. Okay, so fight or flight is sympathetic nervous system. Rest and digest are parasympathetic nervous system responsibilities. Okay, there is a third subdivision of the autonomic nervous system, which is the enteric nervous system. The enteric nervous system is comprised of neurons located in the walls of your GI tract anatomy. So, definitely the stomach, small intestine, large intestine. And these neurons help coordinate and regulate the overall process of digestion. There's still a lot of mystery about some aspects of our digestive process, and a lot of that mystery has to do with microorganisms that are in our body, right? We know, even though the course you're in is not a microbiology course, we know that there's lots of microbes on the surface of our body, on our skin, and inside our body in areas that we just often don't think about, right? There are naturally occurring bacteria that run through our bloodstream, although we tend not to think about that, okay? And so let me ask you this in the chat window. Here we go. How many microorganismal cells exist in and on our body for each one human cell that makes up our body? What's the current estimate that science throws out there? How many microorganismal cells? And when I say microorganismal, let's be clear, I'm talking about bacteria. I'm talking about fungi. I'm talking about protozoa. We might even at some point want to include viruses in that population. Okay, so okay, Shay, thank you for contributing there. Okay, so Shay, you've given me a number that is not the answer to my question, but I think it's the answer to a different question. So Shay says 100 trillion. All right, so here's the idea, folks, and thanks for everybody for contributing and guessing here. I appreciate that. So let me read the question again. The question is, how many microorganismal cells exist in and on our body for each one human cell? In other words, what is the ratio of microorganismal cells to each one human cell that makes up our body? The best we can say at this time is about 10. You know, that's a rough ballpark that we think is fairly accurate. Karen, you hit it right on the nose. Good job. Okay, so about 10 bacterial cells, 10 protozoal cells, 10 fungal cells for each one human cell. So think about it. That means if our human bodies are made of roughly 50 trillion human cells, then that means we expect that our human body also carries about 500 trillion microorganisms at any given moment of time. We don't tend to think about them too much unless we're sick. But the point of it is those microorganisms in us and thriving in us and on us are part of our body's physiology and doing things for us that we sometimes really have no clue about. And so what I'm saying here is that the enteric nervous system that we're defining here as part of the parasympathetic nervous system definitely is influenced by the microorganisms in the digestive tract. Those microorganisms are living off food molecules that we are consuming. And then those microorganisms are releasing molecules that have the ability to interact with other cells, including neurons. All right, so it's still quite a bit of a mystery exactly how the process of digestion is really coordinated from the nervous system, from the population of microbes in our body. That is still largely a mystery, okay? So let me ask you this. Have you heard of irritable bowel syndrome? Okay, irritable bowel syndrome or Crohn's disease, right? These are conditions of the digestive tract that are largely influenced by populations of microorganisms being kind of unhappy about circumstances and producing molecules that then inflame the target organs of their surrounding environment. We still don't understand it very well, but we know that the microbes are definitely involved. Okay. So the enteric nervous system interacts with microorganisms in the GI tract and are influenced by those microbes in ways we don't understand yet. Okay. All right. All right, folks. So I think we've come to the bottom of our nervous system pyramid that we're constructing, okay? So let's take a quick look again what we've written into our notes, right? Imagine that you have a pyramid or a triangle, if you will, and at the very top of the pyramid is the phrase nervous system. And then we start to break that down into subcategories, right, as we go down the pyramid. So you start with nervous system, you break it down into central nervous system for the brain and spinal cord, and on the other side of the pyramid, the peripheral nervous system. That's all the tissue of the nervous system that's not part of the brain and spinal cord. You take the peripheral nervous system and you walk further down the pyramid. You divide it into the sensory division, which sends information into the central nervous system. That includes somatic senses, capable of detecting touch, pressure, etc. Special senses for things like vision, hearing, smell. The second subdivision of the peripheral nervous system is the motor division. Okay, that sends information out of the central nervous system to a target organ, typically a muscle or gland. The motor division on the pyramid, we break that out into further subcategories as we go further down the pyramid. The motor division can be divided into the somatic nervous system, which coordinates skeletal muscle contraction, and the autonomic nervous system, which coordinates smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glandular function. The autonomic nervous system, right? I mean, if you think about it, the somatic nervous system, which coordinates skeletal muscle contraction, that largely involves neurons that are under conscious control, right? You can think right now, open and close my hands, open and close my hands, right? And so the muscles of the hand and the wrist that are involved in that are controlled by your conscious mind. The autonomic nervous system is maintained by neurons that are generally not under conscious control. You cannot say to yourself, okay, pancreas, shoot out some additional insulin right now. It's simply going to ignore your brain when you do that. It's going to ignore your mind. So the autonomic nervous system is under involuntary control, and it regulates smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. The autonomic nervous system is further subdivided into three categories: sympathetic for fight or flight responses, parasympathetic for rest and digest activities, and then the enteric nervous system, which is heavily invested in the process of digestion in ways we don't completely understand yet. Gang, do you have any questions right now? I believe if you take some time during your private study efforts to organize this information, future conversations in the semester are just going to be easier. It's going to make more sense to you, okay? So I want to encourage you to spend some time getting the hierarchy of the nervous system pyramid situated in your mind, okay? Okay, let's continue here. We're going to define some, I'm going to turn the page in the textbooks. I'm now moving away from figure 12.1. And I'm going to go to some basic terminology here. And we're going to define some things and maybe talk about them a little bit differently or deeper than we have in the past. All right, so let's start with the word neuron. Okay, you were first exposed to the word neuron in chapter 4 of this course. Of course, I appreciate you probably knew what a neuron was at some other moment of your life. But a neuron is a cell of the nervous system that can generate electrical signals, and with some limited exceptions, generally speaking, mature neurons do not reproduce. Okay. So a neuron is a cell of the nervous system that can create electrical signals, and by and large, they do not reproduce. Okay. And if you think about it, that's what makes a stroke so devastating. The fact that the neurons cannot reproduce, right? A stroke, okay. A stroke simply means death of neurons, death of neurons. Now, that stroke, which is the death of the neurons, could be precipitated by many different things, such as an infection, such as blockage of blood flow to the brain, different regions of the brain, right? So there's lots of things that could promote the death of the neuron. So the term stroke does not talk about, well, what's causing the neurons to die, but the stroke is the event where the neurons pass away. Okay, an event in which neurons die. And so since neurons by and large do not reproduce, strokes can be very debilitating. I suspect you probably know someone in your life that had a stroke, and you might notice that he or she just quite isn't the same after that event, right? I mean, some people are very fortunate to have very mild strokes and they pretty much are okay after that. They got lucky. But then there's other folks that have really traumatic events and they're not lucky anymore, okay? So it's one of those things that we hope no one has to experience. Okay, now when we talk about neurons, there's many different subtypes of neurons, and if you take a neurology course someday, which you might for your education, you'll go into these kinds of topics even more than we're going to go here in our course. But I do want to define 3 types of neurons for you. There are more than 3, but we're only going to talk about 3 in our course. Okay, first we have the sensory neurons. And you say, okay, I get you. I know I've heard that word before, sensory neuron, right? These are neurons that detect changes in the internal or external environment of the body, right? So neurons embedded in your skin detect temperature changes in the air. That's a sensory neuron. Neurons inside your body, embedded in the anatomy of your internal organs. For example, the aorta is the major artery coming off the top of your heart. Every time your heart squeezes to push blood out and circulate it, that blood goes through the aorta. So the aorta is a tube, and every time blood comes through it, that tube opens up, it widens. Well, the wall of the artery has neurons embedded in it, which are sensory neurons. So every time the artery stretches, because blood is moving through it, those neurons generate electrical signals that go up to the brain, and then your brain becomes aware of what's happening with your heart, and your brain starts to get a neurological picture of what blood pressure is in your body. Okay, so sensory neurons detect changes in the internal and external environments of the body. In addition to the sensory neurons, of course, we have the motor neurons. These are the ones that are going to elicit instructions to effectors. So they deliver instructions from the central nervous system to effectors. And again, those effectors are going to be some type of muscle or gland, right? Some type of muscle or gland. And then we have a third category of neuron, which is probably new to our conversation in the course. We haven't talked about this before. These neurons are called integrative neurons. These integrative neurons are also called inter, I-N-T-E-R, interneurons. So we have integrative neurons or interneurons. That's the same thing. Those terms are synonymous. Okay. The integrative neurons are neurons that are heavily involved in enabling your brain to make a decision. Okay. So let me document a few things and then I'll give you an example here. So integrative neurons help retrieve separate pieces of information and bring them together into a decision center in the brain for the purposes of making a decision. Okay. In terms of raw numbers, we have more integrative neurons in our anatomy than we have sensory or motor neurons. We have more integrative neurons in our body than either sensory or motor neurons. So these are the most abundant type of neuron in the body. So let me give an example of how integrative neurons would work here. And so here's the idea. Let's say for a moment that, it's 8:40, 8:41 in the morning, which is typically breakfast time for most people. So let's say we were all together in the classroom at Hack, and let's say that I wheeled in this tray, I wheeled in this cart, and on the cart, I have trays of food, pancakes, fresh scrambled eggs, maybe some nice seasoned potatoes, some fresh fruit, that kind of thing. And I pass out these plates of food to each of you sitting at a desk. And you're going to be thinking, why is Dr. Allen giving me food, right? And you might think, should I eat this food, right? Maybe he's trying to poison me. Folks, I'm not going to poison you. But the point is, if somebody offered you a plate of food, there's going to be a lot of really unconscious decision-making processes that happen very rapidly, so that in the next second or two, you can say to yourself, okay, I'll eat this. Or you'll say, no thanks, I don't want that right now. So if somebody puts food in front of you, what kind of things are you going to process in your brain? Well, think about it. Aren't you first going to visually look at the food and see if it visually kind of seems appealing, right? So there's going to be visual information the brain's processing. Certainly if it's freshly prepared food, there's probably going to be a fragrance, an aroma, a smell from the food. So you're going to process smell information. You're also going to process a conscious awareness of whether you're actually hungry or not. Because if I give you a plate of food after you've already had a large breakfast at home, obviously you're not hungry. So you might say, well, that looks nice, but I'm just not hungry right now. So I'm not going to eat that, right? So you're going to have an awareness of whether you're full or not. You might actually touch the food to see if it's hot or not, because you say, well, I'll eat it if it's warm, but if it's cold, I don't want to eat it. You might even remember things. You might access your memory banks and say to yourself, well, those pancakes look pretty nice, but you know what? As I think about it, last month I had a breakfast of pancakes, and it wasn't long afterwards that I was sitting on the toilet with diarrhea, or I vomited. What I'm saying is, you will have memories of past events associated with foods that will also integrate into your decision-making process. And so, in ways that medical science can't fully describe yet, because we don't literally have every neuron of the brain mapped out. There are projects to do that, by the way. But we have this general idea that there are neurons that are processing different kinds of information: vision, smell, memory, touch, different kinds of information, and then pulling it together into a focal point within the brain's anatomy that the brain can say, okay, based on all this information I'm retrieving, I'm going to make a decision. I'm going to eat the food. I'm not going to eat the food, okay? So that would be the job of the integrative neurons working together as a team. Okay, so integrative neurons help with decision-making processes. Okay. All right, folks, any questions so far? Okay, so we've covered some ideas about neurons. Second category of cell that you're familiar with in the nervous system is the neuroglial cell. Neuroglial cells often take a back page to the neuron. They're often not as appreciated or kind of ignored, because neurons are kind of the rock stars because they can generate an electrical signal. Neuroglial cells are also cells of the nervous system. They do not create electrical signals, but they can reproduce. And so generally speaking, the functions of the neuroglial cells, as best as we can tell, is to support the health and well-being of the neurons. So you might think of neuroglial cells as sort of butlers, nannies, caretakers of neurons. Some glial cells are definitely functioning. I mean, as you get deeper into your education, what science is discovering is that, there are actually different subtypes of neuroglial cells as well. And so there are subtypes of neuroglial cells that function in your immune system. Some neuroglial cells have defensive characteristics in the brain, defending your neurons and other structures from pathogens, bacteria, viruses, things like this. Okay. Some neuroglial cells have been implicated in maintaining the anatomical structure that are called synapses, right? Synapses are the junctions between cells. Now, you already know of one kind of junction, right? It's called a neuromuscular junction, but you can also have neuron to neuron junctions. Those are also synapses. And so maintaining the anatomical structure of those synaptic connections and the chemical environment around that synaptic connection is very important for the overall health of your brain. And neuroglial cells seem to be involved in maintaining the healthy environment so that your brain can actually learn. Okay, learning a new skill, like learning an instrument, involves forming synaptic connections. If we want those synaptic connections to be robust and stay healthy, then neuroglial cells are involved in maintaining those synaptic connections. Okay, not only learning, but memory formation and retrieval. Okay. I mean, we all know as we get older, sometimes we don't remember things like we used to, right? I mean, we just don't. And so there's an argument that, as we age, the cells of our body become less efficient at doing tasks they used to be capable of doing. All right, so we'll have more to say about neuroglial cells pretty soon here, okay? Next, number 3, nerve. The term nerve, okay? A nerve refers to a bundle of hundreds to thousands of axons. So axons, right, are the long cytoplasmic extensions off the cell body of a neuron. Okay, you can see that in figure 12.2. We're going to be talking about figure 12.2 in about 60 seconds here. So a nerve is a bundle of many axons where the axons are running parallel to each other, right? So if each one of my hands is an axon and I position them parallel to each other, right? These two axons could be part of a nerve fiber, okay? So a nerve is basically a group of neurons and their parallel axons running next to each other. From an anatomical perspective, the nerve is also going to include the connective tissue that organizes the axons into a discrete bundle, as well as the blood supply that serves that bundle of axons, okay? So a nerve is a bundle of hundreds to thousands of axons that run parallel to each other, and also includes the connective tissue and blood vessels that support and nurture those axons. Okay. Now, in lab, right? In your word bank, you have cranial nerves that you're going to have to know for your third lab exam. You have 12 pairs of cranial nerves that come out of the brain, okay? You have 12 pairs of cranial nerves. These are part of your word bank responsibility for the third lab exam. We also have 31 pairs of spinal nerves that come off the spinal cord. You do not have to know those for your lab exam, okay? So, take comfort that we're not asking you to know everything. We're just asking you to know an unreasonable amount, right? So you have 31 pairs of spinal nerves, okay? All right. Any questions at this time, folks? Okay, let's talk about figure 12.2. This is part of nervous tissue histology. And so I would ask and encourage you to be looking at this anatomy in your textbook as I go over it. Okay, and so we'll talk about the neuron itself of figure 12.2. Okay, I'll break it down this way here and put this onto a new page. Here we go. Okay, so first off, the cell body, right? The cell body you've been reading about for some weeks now. The cell body is sort of the most circular region of the cell, and it contains most of the standard organelles you would expect for a traditional eukaryotic cell. The rounded portion of the neuron, which contains standard organelles of a typical eukaryotic cell. Okay, so in other words, you're going to find the nucleus present in the neuron in the cell body. The nucleus is going to have the chromosomes with the DNA, your entire genome. You're going to find mitochondria there. You're going to find the Golgi complex. You're going to find lysosomes, peroxisomes, a variety of vacuoles, all kinds of cytoskeletal elements. The traditional architecture of a eukaryotic cell is represented in the cell body of a neuron. Okay, now here's where we can talk about some terms that are starting to creep up in our conversation in lab. Okay, you might recall from last time, I'm not sure, but you'll certainly know from after today's conversation that within the brain and spinal cord conversation we're having in lab, you can have groups of cell bodies from neurons that are organized as a cluster. And when you have a cluster of cell bodies, excuse me, when you have a cluster of cell bodies in the central nervous system, that's referred to as a nucleus. Right? So you have to be very careful, right? In biology, just like every area of life, the meaning of a word is very contextual. What meaning we're using depends on the context of the conversation. In chapter 3, the word nucleus referred to the internal organelle of a single cell where the chromosomes are located. But in the nervous system, there's an alternative use of the word nucleus. And you might say, well, that's unfortunate because it makes it confusing. And I agree with you. There's lots of areas in life where that's true, right? It's unfortunate because the word is being used differently. In the nervous system physiology, a group of cell bodies in the central nervous system is a nucleus. The comparable structure, where you have a group of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system, is given a different word. That different word is ganglion. Ganglion. A cluster of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. Okay. All right, let's keep going here. Number 2. So in figure 12.2, do you see the phrase Nissl bodies? Nissl bodies, N-I-S-S-L. Take a look. Nissl bodies is near the cell body of the neuron. It's sort of the bottom left of the cell body itself. Okay, so Nissl bodies. Nissl bodies are rough endoplasmic reticulum in the neuron. You might say, well, why the heck don't we just call it rough endoplasmic reticulum? Well, you know, folks, as you get more specialized, we're going to have more specialized terms here. Okay, Nissl is N-I-S-S-L. This is neuron-specific rough endoplasmic reticulum. We also have neurofibrils. Okay, neurofibrils are part of the neuron cytoskeleton. Okay, neurofibrils. That term is on the right side of the cell body there in figure 12.2. Part of the neuron's cytoskeleton. Okay, the neurofibrils are made of chains of protein called intermediate filaments. You might recall the phrase intermediate filaments from your time studying chapter 3. Okay, I'm just going to speak some of the names of the proteins we find in these intermediate filaments. Promise you I'm not going to test you on it, so I'm not going to write it down. But some of the proteins we find in these intermediate filaments that are part of the neuron cytoskeleton would include proteins like keratin. You've heard of keratin before when we talked about the keratinocytes in your skin. Another protein, which I don't think we've ever talked about, called vimentin. Another protein called desmin. Another protein called peripherin. And another protein called lamin, L-A-M-I-N. Okay, so you've heard them. Don't worry about them. Not going to be tested on the names of those proteins. Okay, number 4, a nerve fiber. Okay, a nerve fiber refers to any extension off the cell body. So you know some of them already, right? Dendrites, axons. Okay, any extension off the cell body. Okay, so we have different types here. We have dendrites. Dendrites are nerve fibers that always receive information. They receive information typically from another neuron. We have axons. You know, the standard textbook description of a neuron is going to show you a neuron that has multiple dendrites and then a neuron that has one axon. And while that is frequently true in the nervous system, it is possible that you can have a neuron that has multiple axons. That does exist. Okay, so axon is a nerve fiber that sends information away from the cell body. So we'll talk about how the electrical signal is created in the neuron in about 60 seconds. But at any rate, when the neuron generates an electrical signal and it wants to communicate information to another cell, typically that electrical signal will start itself at the axon and propagate away from the cell body. So send information away from the cell body to communicate with other cells. Okay, think about the neuromuscular junction conversation we just had, right? We described it as an axon next to the plasma membrane of the muscle fiber. Well, that axon, if we trace it up, will reach the cell body, correct? So that's what we're talking about here. Okay, now within the axon of figure 12.2, I want to highlight a subsection or a subregion of the axon. It's super mega important for nervous system physiology. That section of the axon is called the axon hillock. Axon hillock. So folks, take a look at the axon hillock of figure 12.2. The way to find this is to identify the cell body and the axon and find where the axon immediately comes off the cell body. So look for axon hillock. Axon hillock is the region of the axon that immediately comes off the cell body. It's very close to the cell body. Okay, the axon hillock is super important because this is where most nerve impulses in the axon are created. Okay, this is the usual site of nerve impulse creation. And I want to say some things here that might not make too much sense yet, but the reason the axon hillock is the specific section where most nerve impulses start is because the anatomy of the axon hillock is very unique. And by that, I mean the plasma membrane of the axon hillock has an unusually high quantity of ion channels, particularly sodium ion channels. And when sodium ion channels open and allow sodium from the extracellular fluid to enter the cytoplasm of the axon of the neuron, that's the initial trigger called depolarization to actually start a nerve impulse. So the axon hillock is the site where most nerve impulses start, because in that region of the axon's plasma membrane, you have a large abundance of ion channels. Okay. Okay, this region of the axon has a large density of sodium ion channels critical for starting nerve impulses. Okay. The second thing I would draw your attention to here in regards to the axon is, so we've defined the axon hillock, right? The second thing, which you already know about, are the synaptic end bulbs. We talked about the synaptic end bulbs with the neuromuscular junction. The synaptic end bulbs represent the very end of the axon terminals. And you notice in figure 12.2 that even though you have a single axon, as we get closer to the end of the axon, there's multiple branches that come off the very end, which are called axon terminals. Each axon terminal ends in this rounded bulb structure called a synaptic end bulb. Okay, so the synaptic end bulbs are the very ends of the axon terminals from which neurotransmitter molecules are released. Okay. In a later chapter of this course, you will read about some of the different varieties of neurotransmitters that your brain cells manufacture and release. It's not just all about acetylcholine, right? It's about other things like serotonin, dopamine, GABA, okay? All kinds of molecules that have weird names. Okay, folks, any questions about the anatomy of the neuron from figure 12.2? Okay, then what I'm going to do next is move to some observations about neuroglial cells. So I'm going to move to figure 12.6 at this time. And so first we're going to talk about neuroglia of the central nervous system. Which is figure 12.6. All right. So, we mentioned previously that there actually are subtypes of glial cells. So we're going to be a little bit more precise about that at this time. If you look at figure 12.6, notice the term astrocyte. Astrocyte. If you look carefully, you can see in figure 12.6, you can see along the left-hand column, you can see fibrous astrocytes. You can see protoplasmic astrocytes, okay? So for right now, I'm just going to ask you to be familiar with the term astrocyte, okay? In the central nervous system, astrocytes do a number of things. They are known to help maintain the physical integrity of a structure called the blood-brain barrier. We have not talked about the blood-brain barrier in our course, and you will get more of it in A&P2, but just so you have some awareness of this, right? Surrounding your brain and spinal cord are blood vessels that must provide oxygen and nutrients to the brain cells, right? But we want to be sure that we don't let potentially harmful, dangerous things from the bloodstream into the cerebrospinal fluid that could actually hurt the brain cells, right? So the blood-brain barrier is actually a physical network of blood capillaries. Capillaries are the tiniest blood vessels of the body. And so when you build a network of them together, you have a capillary bed. And if you arrange the capillary beds in just the right way, you build this structure called the blood-brain barrier. And the purpose of the blood-brain barrier is to act as a selective filter for moving cargo from the bloodstream into the cerebrospinal fluid that then sustains the brain tissue. So the purpose of the blood-brain barrier is for defense, to be sure that potentially harmful toxic substances don't enter the brain. Sometimes the blood-brain barrier works just as it's intended, and it does screen out things that might harm the brain. Other times it's not successful. Other times the blood-brain barrier actually prevents proper treatment of brain diseases because certain medications and drugs you might want to deliver to the brain through the bloodstream won't cross the blood-brain barrier. That makes it harder to treat inflammation and other infections. Okay. So the blood-brain barrier is a network of capillaries which functions to selectively filter molecules in the blood and keep potentially harmful substances away from neurons. Okay. All right. Let's see, what else can we tell you about astrocytes? Astrocytes, at least in studies of embryonic tissue, so embryos, astrocytes help the brain develop these neuronal connections called synapses. I said that before, right? The glial cells help maintain synapses. And the astrocytes also help maintain the proper chemical environment so that neurons in that same space have the ability to create electrical signals. Okay, and so last thing is astrocytes. Scientific studies have revealed and seem to confirm that astrocytes do play a role in learning and memory. Okay, so that's astrocytes. Okay. Next, we have in figure 12.6, we have oligodendrocytes. Oligodendrocytes are the type of cell that forms the myelin sheath around central nervous system axons. You might have heard in other aspects of your life that the peripheral nervous system has the myelin sheath, and that's true. The myelin sheath in the peripheral nervous system is made of a different type of cell called a Schwann cell. We will be documenting this in your notes pretty soon. But within the central nervous system, you find areas of the brain that have myelin sheath and other areas of the brain that don't. So the areas of the brain that do have myelin sheath, the myelin sheath in the central nervous system is made of a different kind of cell called an oligodendrocyte. Oligodendrocytes. Okay. And I'll just mention one thing here. They are responsible for forming and maintaining myelin sheath in the central nervous system. Okay. And of course, one very reasonable question will be, well, what's the function of the myelin sheath? We're going to get there, folks. We're going to get there. Okay. I'll say one thing. Myelin sheath has this uncanny ability to actually accelerate the transmission speed of electrical signals. We'll describe how that functions a little bit later on. Okay, next we have microglia. Okay, microglia. Microglia actually function as phagocytes. So from that perspective, they are white blood cells of the immune system that potentially protect your brain tissue from the invasion of microorganisms that might cause you harm. I just happened to stumble upon a news story, which is kind of gross, but a news story last night about a gentleman from Guatemala who's living in the United States, and he recently was rushed to the emergency room because he was unresponsive and having like a seizure disorder. But a long story short, that gentleman had a tapeworm living in his brain. Okay, so I'm sure that gentleman's phagocytes were doing their best to overcome the tapeworm, but unfortunately were not successful. Okay. All right, let's see. We're just about. Let me finish this section, folks, and we'll pause. The final category of cells from figure 12.6 that I'm going to share with you are the ependymal cells. Okay. I don't know if you remember from last lab, but one of the structures we shared with you from last lab was the lateral ventricle. The lateral ventricle. And we said the ventricles are the areas where the cerebrospinal fluid is circulating, right? Well, the ventricles, their inner lining, the inner lining of cells is made of these cells, the ependymal cells. Ependymal cells line the ventricles of the brain and the central canal of the spinal cord that is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, these cells actually act as a filter to filter blood plasma to form the cerebrospinal fluid. So ependymal cells participate in the production of cerebrospinal fluid. Okay. All right. That's a good stopping place, folks. So we'll stop at this time. Do you have any questions? Okay. All right. So we have lab this morning. The Zoom channel will stay on. Let's take a nice break. Let's start lab at 9:35. Let's start lab at 9:35. So I'll see you in about 17 minutes, folks. Okay. Take a break. See you soon.